So we're going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, looking in verse 22 and 23. And chapter 36, the last chapter in the book. 2 Chronicles 36, 22 and 23. And I would tell you what my hope is of how far I get, but I'm not going to in case I disappoint myself. And so, looking here at the last, we've read this verse before. And this was kind of indicating what was going to take place. And so, we'll actually get into it and kind of cover some of these things. And in verse 22 it says, "Now the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing." And so the last verse of this book now says, "Thus says Cyrus king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me." And I'm going to go ahead and shut this door right quick, because we got some. Yes, thanks. Sorry about that, everybody. And so he says, the last verse, it says, "The Lord has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." And so this is an opportunity here. Now, when he says build a house, he's talking about the temple here. So now Ezra is going to go in the next book. If you turn over in Ezra chapter 3, verse 8, they're going to start building the temple. And just like most good things, when you try to do something good, you're going to have some opposition. And so in chapter 4, verse 3, 4, and 5, it talks about there being some opposition. And there being some bribes, all kinds of stuff to frustrate and cause the people to be afraid. And so from Ezra 3, they start to build. Ezra 4, all of a sudden they have some opposition. And so with that, in verse 5, it says, "And bribe counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus the king of Persia, until the reign of Darius king of Persia." And so we actually have in chapter 4 of this book, verse 24, so the last verse of that chapter we were looking at, it says, "The work of the house of the God that is in Jerusalem stopped." So they started it, and then it stopped. And then it's going to resume later on in chapter 5, verse 2, they start going again. And so then at this point, you have Haggai and Zechariah now are going to be writing during this period. And so a lot of things happen. And what I think and I find very interesting is you have a lot of prophets now that are still talking, because God's still giving them encouragement to give to the people. So God, even though bad things take place, God hadn't forgotten them, and he hadn't forgotten us. And that's a good thing to remember during those times where it seems like, man, no, he still haven't forgot his promises, and he's still true. Here at this time, I want you to now turn to Zechariah, because this is taking place during this time. And I wanted you to see some of the language that's being done. So Zechariah 9:9. And so it says in Zechariah 9:9, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a colt." So who is that talking about? So in Zechariah, and Zechariah is written several hundred years before Jesus ever comes on the scene, and it's being prophesied that he's going to be riding, your king, he's going to be coming on a donkey. Now, what did kings ride on back in those days?
Chariots.
Well, also, what kind of animal? It'd be a horse. Kings ride on a horse. Even in that day, they ride on a horse. But our king's going to be riding on a donkey. That is the work animal. That's the one that's humble and that gets the work done. That's our Savior. He is humble and he got the work done. And so what's interesting here, as you hold your spot in Zechariah, turn over to Matthew 21. That'll be a little bit easier book to find. Matthew 21. And verse 5, I'll start in verse 1. It says, Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Carthage, to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to two disciples, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and the colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. And in verse 5, these things took place to fulfill what the prophet was saying. And there in verse 5 it says, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of the beast of burden. And so this is all prophecy taking place. And so with that, now if you go back to Zechariah 11, we see another prophecy that takes place. And in chapter 11, verse 12 and 13. 11, verse 12 and 13. And I just want to say, I know Bridget's just come in, and I know she's been through a lot of pain, and just her being here is a pretty big deal. And it's good to see you. And she's still going through pain, by the way. 12 and 13. Then I said to them, It is good. It seems good to you. If it seems good to you, give me my wages. But if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, Throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them in the house of the Lord to the potter. Now, this is a prophecy as well. And this is going to take place in Matthew 27. And we know from our reading of the gospel account is who's throwing that? This is Judas, right? He got 30 pieces of silver. And it says here in verse 9, Then it was fulfilled of Matthew 27, verse 9. Then it was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, And they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him whom a price had been sent by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave it to them for a potter's house as the Lord directed me. And so it's actually said in Zechariah and by the mouth of Jeremiah. Now, one more from Zechariah. In chapter 12, Zechariah 12, verse 10. It says, And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look upon me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child and weep bitterly over him, as one weeps over a firstborn. So they look over the one they've pierced. And so now go to John chapter 19. John chapter 19, verse 37. And as it talks about Jesus dying, and remember, this is hundreds of years before this ever takes place. In chapter 19, verse 37 of John, it says, And again, another scripture says, and they will look on him whom they've pierced. And so every single thing you go down, it's echoing and it's whispering. And now the shouts are getting louder. It keeps talking about Jesus over and over through the centuries. And if you were there during that time, you would have gotten pretty excited. You'd be thinking, okay, the land promise was fulfilled. The nation promise was fulfilled. He is still talking and prophesying that there's a blessing in which all people will be blessed. And so you don't know what it would be, but you don't know when, but you know it's coming because our God always keeps his promises. So this would have been encouraging as reading Zechariah. Now this would have taken place during that time where Ezra was building the temple. And then when it stopped, these things, Haggai and Zechariah, would have been written. Then if you go back to Ezra right after 2 Chronicles, we see in chapter 6, sometimes it's easy to remember some things. And I'll give you an easy way to remember when the temple's built, and then later on when Nehemiah comes in and the wall around Jerusalem's built. And so Ezra 6:15, it says, this house was finished. So that means the temple is finished in Ezra 6:15. Now, the next book to the right is Nehemiah. And Nehemiah 6:15, what does it say? The wall's finished. All right, so in both of these, chapter 6 and 15, Ezra, the temple's finished. Nehemiah, the wall's finished. And so, but in between the temple being finished and the wall being finished, we don't yet have the first group is already gone to go build the temple. And the second and the third group is going to go. But before the second and third group of exiles, people that have been brought to Babylon, can go back to their home country, turn to the book of Esther. That's going to be right before Job. Or be right after Nehemiah. Either way. And so Esther is set right in between, as soon as the temple's complete, then you have the story of Esther. And so you have a first group that's gone back to Babylon, but you don't have a second and third. And you're not going to have a second and third unless Esther steps up. So let's read in verse 1. We have a king, Ahasuerus, Esther 1:1. Ahasuerus is actually the way it's pronounced. I had to practice this a little bit. In other versions, it just says Xerxes. And so Ahasuerus would be the proper name, and he reigns over 127 provinces. He is the superpower of the day. He would be the leader of that superpower. And so now, you take note in verse 3, it's his third year of his reign. And in verse 4, he's showing all the stuff he's got. And so, how many days is he showing everything that he's got? 180 days is a long time to be bragging, isn't it? Do you guys have enough to brag for 180 days? Half a year? I mean, I'm done in about 30 seconds. That's it. And so he has 180 days of just, look at me, guys. Just look at me. Okay, that was day 49. What about 50? Wait till you see 50. I mean, he just keeps going, showing all his stuff. And so after that's over with, in verse 5, they have a feast. How long does this feast last? 7 days. I mean, the bragging should have been over before 7 days. Now he's going to have a feast of 7 days. And so in verse 7, they're served all kinds of drinks. Vessels of different kinds. It's just over the top. And in verse 8, the command is given that there should be no compulsion, is the way mine reads. Meaning, don't hold back. You drink as much as you want. And it says, as each man desires. And so they can have as much as they want during the 7 days. And so now, in verse 10, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, what does that mean? Yeah, he's just toast. I mean, he is wasted big time. He is drunk, and now he's like, in verse 11, let's bring out the queen. Let's bring out Vashti and have her put the royal crown on, and let's look at her, because she's lovely to look at. Now, some commentaries talk about the fact that the reason why she refused, it could be one or two things. It could be the fact that she's going before a bunch of drunk men and, get your hands off, that kind of thing. I'm not going to be around the nonsense. Another one is the fact that she would just be without clothes. The only thing she'd be wearing is her crown. And that might give you more reason, if that's the case, more reason to say why the queen would refuse. But either way, we know that in verse 12, she refuses. And so knowing that she refuses, you have a group of guys that kind of gather around. And these guys start saying, man, if we let this woman get away with it, the queen get away with it, this isn't going to be good. Because if we do that, then it says in verse 17, for the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. And so they're saying something needs to be done, because now we're not going to have any peace, because these women are not going to know their place. And so that becomes a big deal. So then he signs a decree that she is banished from his sight, never to enter his presence again. And in chapter 2, verse 1, he's no longer angry anymore. And he had written this down, and it couldn't be repealed because it was of the law of the Persians and Medes. And that comes from verse 19 of chapter 1. But in chapter 2, his anger subsides. And so all of a sudden, he starts remembering the good times. And he starts remembering about the queen, right? So he's really feeling like, man, what did I do? I shouldn't have listened to the fellas. That's usually when us guys get in trouble. We start listening to the fellas. And so then they said, well, hey, and they have the king's eunuch says, well, hey, what about this? In verse 4, let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And so they gather around, and the news comes out about this. And in verse 5, we have Mordecai. He's a Benjamite. And this would have been, the Jews that we're going to be talking about in this story are those that didn't go back home when they first had the chance to go back and build the temple. Back then, Judah would have been known as out in the country, out in the sticks. It had been a backwards, Wild West type of scenario, because everything has been overtaken. You have different people coming into town that are not Jews at this point. So it would not look like their hometown, which may be a reason why a lot of them didn't want to go back home. And so he had been bringing up Hadassah in verse 7, who is known as Esther. And that's his cousin. It was the daughter of his uncle, so it's his cousin. And he brought her up because her parents had died. And it mentions that she's beautiful here. And all of a sudden, they decide to have a beauty contest, basically. And so they get all these women gathered up. And let's see, Ronnie, you're going to have to help. Josephus, there we go. Josephus, the historian, he says that there were about 400 women that were, collected in this. And so 400 women, and Esther in verse 10 was not supposed to tell who her people is, or what people she belongs to, as Mordecai told her not to. And in verse 12, look at how long they had to go through this regiment, this beauty regiment. You got 6 months of oil, basically, making your skin all nice and soft, I guess. And 6 months of spices and ointments, smelling good. And so my whole thought is, if it takes 12 months for a person, that's not a good sign. And so we've got these ladies 12 months of all this to know how to take care of themselves and do all the things they need to do. And so when this takes place, now, if you look look at verse 16 of chapter 2. What year is this reign? Seventh year? So this started with Vashti in the 3rd year. So now it's 4 years. So you have a big gap. A lot of times we read this story, we think it just kind of boom, 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 hit back and forth. But we have Queen Vashti leaving, and now this takes place, a 4-year span. And at that point, after the 4 years, he had just suffered a loss from Greece, and he comes back. And at this point, when he comes back, in verse 17, it says, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. And so he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so now she is queen. No one still knows who she is. And in verse 21, Mordecai is sitting by the gate, and he hears these 2 eunuchs that are talking about how they're going to kill the king. And so in 22, Mordecai, having knowledge of this, tells the queen, Esther, that what's taking place. And in verse 23, the affair was investigated and found to be so, and the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of Chronicles, in the presence of the king. And so now you have that to note, as some of you guys know this story well. But in chapter 3, we have the king promotes Haman. He's an Agagite, and that we've talked about that when we went through. King Saul was supposed to have killed all of them, and he didn't. And this seems like this is one that was spared, who now has wound his way up. Now he's the right-hand man. And so he advanced with him and set him, his throne above the officials who were with him. And so he wants everybody to bow in verse 2 because now of the statue he's got. And who doesn't bow in verse 2? Mordecai doesn't bow, because Mordecai is not going to bow to anybody but God. Now, when this happens, in verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow, man, he was ticked off, just mad, angry. And so at this point, in verse 6, Haman is set not to just to destroy Mordecai, but all the Jews. Now remember, the 2nd and 3rd wave haven't gone down to Jerusalem. They haven't gone back to Judea. We don't see God written here at all whatsoever. His name is not here. No one mentions his name. And we talked about how God, in an extraordinary way, took care of things in the days of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And now he's going to come in a different way. God's able to save in a lot of different ways. And so here, he is, in verse 7, he casts lots. And that's really important, because now the Jews to this day have a time period that they still worship, Purim, because Purim means lots, as we get from chapter 9, 24 and 25. And so it's known as the Festival of Lights. So basically, they're celebrating the fact that that was supposed to be their demise. And it was by lots. So they celebrate this whole aspect that Haman's got set up. And so they even talk about when they retell the story with the little kids, and kind of like what we're doing here, when they retell the story, when they bring up the name Haman, all the kids are instructed to say boo, and all that kind of stuff, to drown out his name, because he's that kind of a guy. Nobody really likes him. Obviously the king was, smitten by him and didn't really understand his character, but he's going to find out. And it says in verse 8, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. And this is in the millions, is what he's paying. And so there's some people think that he didn't have that money, but what he's thinking is when he kills all these Jews and he collects and plunders their goods, he's going to give that to the king, and that would be the millions that they had stored up that he would give to the king. Not sure, but he is promising hundreds of millions of dollars to him. And so in verse 11, the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, so do that seems good to you. And so letters are sent in verse 13, and it's instruction to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all the Jews. And it tells them, young and old, women and children, on this certain day. And so it's spread out to everybody. And so now the Jews have no way to defend themselves. And so this decree is put out. And so Mordecai, in chapter 4 now, hears about what's happened and what's been done. And so he is pretty distressed. And he goes and in verse 3, he's in sackcloth, he's in ashes, he's fasting, he's weeping. And in verse 4, when Esther's young women and her eunuchs, because she's got a whole group of entourage taking care of her now, and her eunuchs had told her the queen was deeply distressed. And so she sent garments to Mordecai so that he might put on these, but he refuses. And so Mordecai in verse 8, skip down there, it says he gives him a copy of the written decree. And he shows it to Esther. And he says, and explains it to her, and to command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead on him on behalf of her people. And so, man, in verse 11, all the king's servants and all of the people and the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death. So she knows it. She says, and I hadn't seen him in 30 days. He hadn't called for me. He hadn't wanted to see me in 30 days. And so now she knows if she goes through these doors right here, that there's most likely going to be death. Now, this is the key to the whole story. I get choked up every time I read this. I've been reading it several times this morning so I don't get choked up. And so Mordecai says, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. You're not going to escape this. They're going to find out who you are. Just because I told you to keep silent, they're going to find out. And then he says, and Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. So it's a back and forth deal. Go and gather the Jews and be found in the capital there, and go fast on behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. And then it says, I and the young women will fast also as you do. Then I will go to the king. And then what does she say?
Which is against the law.
I perish. I'm willing to go. And that's what we need. We need to have people that are willing to go where it makes us a little nervous. It makes us a little uncomfortable. It gets us out of our comfort zone. We've got to be willing to have the courage to go. Because God said go into all the world. And so we've got to have the courage to be that example, to be that light, to have those words of encouragement and have those words of good news to share with other folks. And so we've got to have that attitude, just like very similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even if we do perish, we still won't bow down. So Esther is saying, if I perish, but I'm going to go. And if you looked in verse 14, Mordecai tells her the words that I think is the key to this. The key to Esther is 16. If I perish, I perish. The key to this book, I think, is verse 14. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Now notice that. Because God's promise is not going to go without being fulfilled. He's choosing you. But if you decide to go another route, he's going to choose someone because his plan's going to be fulfilled.
That also shows that she had the ability to choose. She wasn't made to do this.
Right.
And we're not made to worship either.
Mm-hmm.
We have the right. God created us with the choice. We can
Right.
either choose to worship him or not.
And through all those, and that's an amazing thing that you say, because through us are people in the past that we've looked at that have chosen. He's used people. And usually when they would come and they would say, Lord, I'm here. And that meant what we talked about in the past, that meant that's a call to action. That means that person's ready. Lord, here I am. That means they're ready. And so you've got a lot of people through the generations who've had that same attitude as Esther. If I perish, I perish, but I'm going to go do this. And he says, but deliverance will rise from another place. But you and your family's house shall perish, will perish. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Reminds me of when Paul is there in Acts chapter 17, in verses 26 and 27, and he says that he sets up the times and the places in which men live, so that perhaps they would reach out to him, even though he's not far from any of us. He determines the times and the places in which we live. He's determined Beeville is the place. 2021 is the time. And so we are living in the same thing so that perhaps we would reach out. And you know what he's done? He has chosen that same time and same place for these people in this community out here, so that perhaps they would feel their way towards God, even though he's not far from them. And guess who he has as vessels? In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it says we're ambassadors, right? We're ambassadors of Christ. So he has us to use us. Man, what an amazing task. If a person wants to find themselves and I need to discover what my purpose is, that's your purpose. That's the amazing thing God has given us. And so looking at this, and at this point, I just have a feeling that if I proceed and move through this story anymore, then I'm not going to finish. So yes, I have disappointed myself because I thought I was going to get past this and be on to Malachi. But I want to just go over a couple things. Who knows whether you come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who's to say? Right? He's telling Esther who's to say. Well, you know what? I look at that, and you can look all through. You can take any person in the Bible and do this with. But you look and you think, man, who's to say there's not a Moses here? That in the latter stage of his life and her life, they're going to do more than they did in the first years. Who's to say there's not a Joshua here that's going to stand up and lead others to the promised land? And I'm talking about heaven. Who's to say that there's not a Noah here that's going to save their family? And wouldn't that be amazing? Where you could say, I was able to save my family. And if all you did was save your family like Noah, that'd be enough, wouldn't it? You got your family. But who's to say that you're not like a David, who's able to go in and have the faith that can tear down any of the giants in your life and build a faith for others? Who's to say there's not Aquila and a Priscilla here that can teach the way more adequately for someone else, that in turn they can go and influence hundreds of thousands? Who's to say there's not a Joseph here that can make a way for his family to survive? Well, what about Daniel? Who's to say there's not a Daniel here that's able to turn a nation? Even though we don't have the position of being a president, who's to say there's not someone that will have the ear of a president one day that can change a nation? Who's to say there's not a Lydia that's just worshiping by the river, and all of a sudden her heart was open? She obeyed, and then comes back home. Her whole family obeys. Who's to say there's not one like the centurion that did the same thing, Cornelius? Or who's to say there's not one like the jailer who lived a difficult life and all of a sudden changed things? Or who's to say there's not a Job? Because I know the announcements. Who's to say there's not a Job in here? Through the faith of your suffering and all the different things that happen in your life and the encouragement that you live and the faith and the hope that you still have is able to encourage others generations from now, just as Job did. Who's to say there's not a John here that's off on some island somewhere by himself, totally alone, and has a revelation that's able to share to others that says, it's going to be tough, but God's going to protect us? Who's to say there's not one here that's in their old age, all alone and isolated, that they're not going to be the one to say, you know what? I know it's going to be difficult, but God's always seen us through. He's going to see us through this as well. Who's to say? But we are here in this day, in 2021, and in this community, Beeville, for such a time as this. So who's to say you aren't going to be that person? Or maybe your kid is going to be that person. Your wife, your husband, your grandparents. Who's to say? If we allow God to use us, there's nothing off the table. I mean, all the opportunities are there. It's amazing what he can do through our lives. This woman, in verse 16, she stands up. And women of that day, are they supposed to be heard, seen, anything? No, she's supposed to be sitting down, but she's standing up. She's speaking up when she's supposed to be shutting up. And that's amazing to me. You've got a woman that says, oh, Mordecai, there's got to be another way. There's got to be another way besides me having to go. But he says, oh, there can be another way, but you and your house are going to perish. But he does say that there will be relief and deliverance for the Jews. Because you've still got to get that second and third wave back to Judah. Because who are we waiting for? We're waiting for the last promise, right? We're waiting for Christ to come. They don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But he's coming, and it's echoed all through. And so we're going to get to a point, and my time has expired, but we're going to get to a point where we're going to have a bunch of silence. It's going to be a big hush. And it's during those times when you don't think that anything's happening. That's when you still got to maintain your hope. And so we'll pick up next time. Thank you.